I'm a hair mineral analysis expert. I have a background in functional medicine, and I educate people using HTMA testing to maximize health, erase debilitating symptoms, and gain energy. I'm a multi-time kettlebell sport world champion, and I'm constantly searching for high-performance pros from all over the world to bring you this human optimization podcast. My name is Lisa Pitel-Killah. Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of the Human Optimization Podcast. And today we are going to dive deep into thyroid and autoimmune with Dr. Sarah Vadeboncoeur. She helps women reboot their thyroid for the energy they can count on. She's a naturopathic doctor and the owner of Docere Naturopathic Clinic located in Ottawa. For the past decade, she's helped women who are suffering from fatigue, thyroid conditions, and hormone imbalance get back to healthy, happy, and a feel-good life. She believes that natural health is the result of creating new habits, one small step at a time, and she's passionate about creating a healthy lifestyle that is enjoyable and sustainable. And she truly believes that coffee, chocolate, and wine can be part of that healthy diet. I love it. Welcome, Sarah.
Totally. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be back.
I'm happy to have you back. So for those of you watching or listening that missed our first podcast, you definitely have to check it out. It is all about thyroid health. And there's some really big aha moments there I know I had. And so you're back because there is so much to talk about when it comes to thyroid. And I really want to dive deep into a couple of autoimmune conditions that can be harmful to the thyroid as well, so that people have a little bit more clarification about what they actually mean and some things that they might be able to do to help them. And so give us a little background, your practice, your specialization in thyroid, just so that everybody understands what you do and how you got into this.
Sure. So as you said, I've been a naturopathic doctor for 10 years. And one of the things I noticed very early on in my practice is that a lot of women were exhausted. They were tired and they were not getting any answers as to why they were so tired from their family doctors. And so they were just seeking my help to try to see if there was something else going on. And so part of what I started to do early in my practice is do some more in-depth testing. So looking at the basic things like whether women are iron deficient or low in B12. But the other thing that I saw that was coming back quite often was that women were either hypothyroid, where maybe they already had a diagnosis and they were already taking medication, but they were still feeling quite tired. Or we were the ones who were discovering that there was something going on with their thyroid that maybe hadn't been picked up previously, or it had been picked up, but they were kind of in this like, we'll wait and see what happens type scenario with their conventional doctor. And so part of what I do now is I really help women to optimize their thyroid health. And a big part of how I do that first thing is to do some thorough testing. And I know we'll talk a bit more about that, but that for me is really the first step, because it's really hard to know what's going on if you don't have the right information.
Right.
And especially with women, when we're looking at fatigue, we often want to blame the thyroid. And sometimes it is the thyroid's fault, but a lot of times it's actually something else. And so the reason I love testing is that it helps me to see, number one, how your thyroid is doing. And we can talk more about all the different parts that I look at, but I also look at other things that relate to your thyroid that could also be causing your symptoms, so that we're not guessing what's going on. We actually have good data for us to know exactly what parts of your health are maybe not optimal, and what areas we really need to focus on. And then for the women who do have a thyroid condition, and this is very common, so 1 in 8 women will be diagnosed with a thyroid condition.
Wow.
And up to half of those women, so that's 16% of women who get thyroid conditions, up to half of those women do not yet have a diagnosis.
Wow.
Meaning there are lots of women walking around tired, losing their hair, putting on weight, feeling cold all the time, feeling depressed, who have a thyroid condition and who don't know it because it hasn't been diagnosed yet. So a big part of what I do is help diagnose them if that is in fact what they have. and then to help create a good plan around how to support your thyroid. And so some of the things we'll talk about today are some of the nutrition and lifestyle pieces that are really important. And then the other piece is making sure that they have access to proper medication if that is in fact part of what they need to manage their thyroid. So I really look at my job as I'm looking at the big picture, because your thyroid doesn't just live by itself in isolation of the rest of your body. It's being affected by everything. And that's one of my favorite kind of sayings that I have with the thyroid. The thyroid affects everything, and the thyroid is impacted by almost everything in your body, meaning what you eat, when you eat, your timing of your meals, your stress levels, how much sleep you get, what's happening with your menstrual cycle, your digestion. All of these things impact your thyroid. So, part of what I think is really important for people to understand is that if you do have a thyroid condition, taking care of your thyroid involves a whole lot more than taking your medication. Taking medication is a really important part of your treatment if that's what you need. But there's this whole other piece that we're often ignoring that makes a world of a difference in terms of how people feel, which is usually what brings them into the office. They don't feel good, but also it helps their thyroid to actually work better on top of taking the medication, which can be, again, very important.
Yeah. And
that's what I do in a nutshell.
In a nutshell, right? Just a small nutshell. Well, the impact is incredible. And the fact that we have all of these women walking around not realizing, or maybe even saying, oh, it's just because I'm getting older that I'm tired or this or that. No, that's not, it's not a good way to think about things.
No. And sadly, I think there still is quite a bit of dismissing of women in our medical system where, and I hear this all the time from my patients, we're told we're tired because we're moms. So if you're tired and you have children, we're not going to do any testing because it's just because you have kids.
Yeah.
Or it's because you're getting older. And this is being said to women who are in their 40s, where you should still be thriving in your 40s and beyond. Or my favorite and most damaging is it's all in your head. Everything is fine. You're stressed. And so part of why this work is so important to me is to acknowledge how women are feeling, to believe that what they're saying is true. I don't know about you, but I have better things to do in my life than to go hang out in my doctor's office. And I think most women do. We're not going there because it's a fun thing to do, to spend half your day waiting. No, we do that because we're unwell and we want help. And unfortunately, we're not always getting the help that we need, or we're not getting the answers that we need. So for me, it's really important for women to get answers. And it doesn't mean it's always your thyroid, but that's the whole point, is that when we actually look at all the pieces, we're able to say, in your case, you know what, it is your thyroid. Or, you know what, great news, your thyroid is great. But by the way, you have a severe iron and vitamin D deficiency, which is why you're exhausted and cold and your hair is falling out. It's actually not your thyroid, it's something else. So that's why I'm so passionate about it, because so many women are suffering and they don't need to be.
Needlessly. And that's sad. And I really, I really hope that they can find answers that they need with whatever care they decide. But if you're feeling that way, then reach out, because it's not normal. We shouldn't feel like that when we age. We should be able to thrive well into our 80s for all intents and purposes. And we shouldn't have to suffer through that. And so let's talk, because more commonly people are hypothyroid, right? So sluggish thyroid. And so let's talk just a little bit, let's do a brief kind of overview about some of those symptoms that can come along with that hypothyroid activity that people may not be aware of.
Sure. I'll kind of try to go from head to toe. So the first one is hair loss. This is a really common complaint among women. I'm losing so much hair. I've lost half my head of hair. Like, what is going on? So your thyroid controls metabolism. And when we think about metabolism, we always think about our weight, and that is part of it. But the metabolism is actually the rate at which everything happens in your body. So when you're hypothyroid, meaning your thyroid is slow or not producing enough hormone, your entire metabolism slows down, which means that every reaction in your body slows down, meaning your ability to grow hair slows down. So you might be losing more, and it's going to take even longer for it to regrow. There's lots of mental and emotional symptoms. Depression is a very common symptom of hypothyroidism. One of the things I encourage anyone who is feeling depressed and who's contemplating taking antidepressants is get your thyroid checked first. Because if your depression is due to hypothyroidism, the appropriate treatment is thyroid medication. It's not antidepressants. And I'm not antidepressants. There is a time and place for those. But again, I think we're giving out medication sometimes without doing any type of investigation. So really important, if you have depression, thyroid should be on your list to look at. People can also get anxiety. So it can show up as both depression and anxiety. Brain fog and memory loss are incredibly common as well. And again, that's because the brain is literally like the function is slowing down. Everything is harder for your body to do when your thyroid is sluggish. So you have to write everything down. It's hard to think clearly. Yeah. Those are very common symptoms. Then if we get into our digestive system, again, because things are slower, people might find that there's changes to their appetite. So maybe they're not quite as hungry, or when they eat, they feel like food is like sitting in their stomach for a long time. We'll often see constipation because literally the whole digestive system is a bit slower. So they're not pooping as often or as easily. And then we also can see lots of fertility issues. So both your ability to get pregnant and to maintain a healthy pregnancy, you need your thyroid to be working. So this is another area. If you are planning on trying to get pregnant, or if you've been trying and not succeeding, thyroid is one of the really important things to look at. Also, if a woman has experienced miscarriage, I always encourage to do some thorough thyroid testing, because hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's, which we'll talk about shortly, those can increase your risk of miscarriage. So there's lots of different ways that our thyroid impacts us. And then if we kind of keep working out, we talked about cold. So cold hands and feet, but often when it's thyroid related, it's this like deep internal cold. Not just your hands and feet, but like your whole body feels cold. And then we'll also see a lot of like skin dryness, and the hair can get dry as well. So it affects, like I said, affects everything, which is why we see symptoms that show up everywhere. I didn't even talk about fatigue. Fatigue is a huge one. One of the most common ones. Weight gain is another big one. And so not everyone will have all of the symptoms. So some people might just have, depression and feel cold, or someone else might have, tired and weight gain. So not everyone's going to have all of the symptoms, but those are some of the most common ones that we will see.
Yeah. And I think sometimes too, people miss linking them together because they're trying to compartmentalize symptoms that are happening rather than looking at the big picture. And that's where sometimes they get missed, right? And so I do want to dive into Hashimoto's and Graves. This is a big one, and what the difference is, because I think it's really important for people to know that they exist and what they mean, essentially.
So both Hashimoto's and Graves are autoimmune conditions that affect the thyroid. So autoimmune conditions is basically an umbrella term to talk about diseases where the immune system mistakenly attacks a part of us. So the immune system is designed to attack things that are foreign. So things like viruses and bacteria and parasites. So if those enter your body, your immune system will mount an attack against them and try to get rid of them as quickly as possible. With autoimmune conditions, the immune system basically goes a bit wonky, and instead of focusing on attacking things like viruses and bacteria, it starts to attack a part of you. And with Hashimoto's and Graves, what's happening is that it is attacking parts of the thyroid. And so Graves and Hashimoto's are basically the autoimmune versions of thyroid conditions. So Hashimoto's would be you are hypothyroid, and you have these thyroid antibodies, which we'll talk about. So basically what your Hashimoto's means that you've got hypothyroidism, but the cause is autoimmune, meaning the reason you become hypothyroid is that the immune system damages parts of the thyroid, and then your thyroid can't produce enough hormones, so it eventually kind of slows down. Graves is the autoimmune version of hyperthyroidism. So in Graves' disease, you have these antibodies that again attack a different part of the thyroid, And in this case, you actually make way too much thyroid hormone and you become hyperthyroid. So Graves' and Hashimoto's are actually really important because they are the #1 causes of thyroid conditions. The #1 reason why people have hypothyroidism is because of Hashimoto's. And again, sadly, in kind of our conventional testing, we don't test for these because there's this idea that it's not important or that there's nothing we can do to treat, which is not correct.
Yeah.
And then Graves is the #1 reason why people get hyperthyroid. And again, the reason it's really important to know is that if you are hypothyroid and you have Hashimoto's and you don't know it, you could be taking your Synthroid or your thyroid medication every day and your blood work looks fine. But what's happening behind the scenes is that your immune system is continuing to mount an attack on your thyroid. And so what typically happens over time is that you're going to need more and more medication as your thyroid starts to get more and more damaged.
Yeah.
And we also know that people with Hashimoto's and Graves also tend to have more symptoms. So that's because when the only treatment we're doing for these conditions is medication, we're actually missing the actual problem, which is the immune system. And so we're just treating half of the problem, which is why people continue to have symptoms. And this is so common. I mean, it's rare that someone has all these symptoms, takes their medication, and wakes up a few weeks later is like, I'm 100% better. Like that was totally, I'm fixed.
That was the answer.
That was the answer. I'm better. I don't think very few people that I've talked to in the past 10 years that's happened to. They definitely feel better because they're getting hormone, but things continue to be a problem. And often it's because this whole other piece has not even been looked at. Yeah. So does that help to kind of explain what those conditions are a little bit?
I think that's a great explanation. And so talking about the antibodies, and then we'll get into kind of what happens and then some testing, because that testing piece is really important. People really don't understand what they need for a thyroid panel because they're not being given, they're not being offered that, right? And so let's talk about the 2 types of antibodies, right, that can have elevations. And what's the difference between them when we're talking about Hashimoto's?
Okay, so the first one, the shorthand is TPO, and that stands for thyroid peroxidase antibody. And so what those are, that you basically make antibodies against this thing called thyroid peroxidase. And thyroid peroxidase is an enzyme that basically helps your body connect iodine to tyrosine. And the reason that that's important is that your thyroid hormone, which we often think about, they're called T4 and T3, but the way that your thyroid makes thyroid hormone is by combining iodine and tyrosine. So if you've got antibodies that are messing up that enzyme, your ability to make these hormones is now reduced. The other one is called anti-TG or anti-thyroglobulin. And thyroglobulin is another enzyme in the thyroid, and that one helps to make these T4 and these T3 hormones. So both of them are involved in thyroid hormone production. And so we can make antibodies against these particular enzymes. And so what happens with Hashimoto's typically is that we're going to see elevated antibodies of one or both of these particular antibodies. And so with Hashimoto's, about 90 to 95% of people with Hashimoto's will have high levels of this TPO or thyroid peroxidase antibody. And then about 60 to 80% of those will also have the TG or the thyroglobulin. Yeah. So you might have one or both that are elevated. And again, the way that you would differentiate whether it was Hashimoto's or Graves, it would not be by which type of antibody you have. I think that's a common misconception that if your TPO levels are high, you automatically have Hashimoto's, or if your TG is high, you automatically have Graves. That's not how we would diagnose it. The way we would diagnose it is that if you have elevated antibodies, we know that you have an autoimmune condition. Yeah. And then we would look at your TSH, your T4, and your T3, and that would help us to determine If you're hypothyroid, plus you have antibodies, you're Hashimoto's.
Yep.
If you're hyperthyroid plus antibodies, you have Graves'. The really important thing to remember about these antibodies, and one of the reasons why they're so important, is that they can go up 7 to 10 years before you have a thyroid problem. Meaning,
Wow.
if we tested these things more often, we could predict who was likely going to get thyroid problems, and we could probably reduce their risk quite a bit by helping to work on the immune system. Because again, the thyroid doesn't just wake up one day and say, I don't feel like working anymore. Like, I'm just going to quit.
I'm tapping out.
I'm tapping out. I'm done here. It happens over years. And again, the number one reason it happens are these thyroid antibodies, which we can measure very easily and relatively inexpensively through our blood. And this happens in my office all the time, that I catch these antibodies where people have symptoms, but they're like, I have all the symptoms, but my doctor keeps checking my TSH and telling me it's normal. I'm like, great, let's do more in-depth testing. And when we do that, we do confirm your thyroid is still okay. The problem is your immune system is mounting an attack.
Yeah.
And so far, your thyroid is holding up okay, but that's not going to probably last forever. And so a case like that, those are actually some of my favorite cases. Because I'm like, we just kind of found you before you develop a full-blown thyroid, and we know that there are things that we can do to help calm this immune response so it doesn't attack your thyroid. So that's why these thyroid antibodies are so important to pay attention to, whether your TSH is normal, or on the flip side, I have patients who've been on medications for 20 years. And then I'm the one to tell them, by the way, you have Hashimoto's. And there's this whole other piece of the puzzle that you want to think about in addition to taking your medication.
Yeah.
So those are what the antibodies do. And that's why they're so important, because they again, they help us to understand why the problem is happening. Why is the thyroid not working? Well, it's because the immune system is trying to attack it.
Exactly. And again, it's getting to that root cause, right?
Yeah.
You're getting to the root cause to be able to say, this here is our scientific data. Now, what do we do? Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that was, we really talked about kind of how that type of disorder puts stress on the body, right? And what happens.
Yeah.
And so when someone gets their so I want to talk, so where do I want to start? Oh my gosh. All right. So everybody tests TSH. It's TSH, TSH, TSH. What does TSH really, what does it tell us? Because most people don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. It is a hormone that's made in the brain. There's a small gland called the pituitary gland. That's where TSH is made. So TSH is basically an indirect look at your thyroid. It's not made in the thyroid. It's a hormone made in the brain that tells your thyroid to make hormone. So I was thinking about this the other day as an analogy, and I'm like, if a woman came to you with a hormonal problem, you would probably check her estrogen and her progesterone, which are the actual kind of hormones. We don't only test, so there's two other hormones called LH and FSH. These are made in the same place that TSH is made. We don't use those and then say, well, based on those, I'm going to assume that your estrogen and progesterone look like this. We would never do that, but we do it all the time for thyroid. We look at this like, I always say TSH is like a doorbell. It's the brain ringing the doorbell to tell the thyroid, like, wakey, wakey, I need you to make some hormone. Yeah. So if I want to know how the thyroid's doing, I'm going to ask the actual thyroid. I'm not going to ask the pituitary gland, hey, how is the thyroid doing? Sometimes it tells us that what's happening, especially if things are quite extreme in terms of your disease. Yeah. But a lot of times it is normal because you haven't dug deep enough to actually look at what the thyroid is doing. So it's a very indirect test. It is a very important test, but on its own, it can miss a lot of problems.
Yeah. Yeah. And so now I want to dive into like a real thyroid panel test. What does that involve? What should people be looking at? And why? Yeah. Why is it important? Because there's so many different factors that are so important when assessing the thyroid.
So the first part of your thyroid panel is the TSH, and it is important. And basically what TSH is telling you is the brain kind of sending the right signal to the thyroid? So is the brain doing its job? Mm-hmm. That's what TSH tells you. That's really all it tells you. The next thing we look at is a hormone called T4. T4 is the main hormone made by your thyroid. So if you want to know how your actual thyroid is doing, you measure T4 because that's where it's made, is in your thyroid. For T4, what I'm typically looking for is that it's going to be in the top half of the range. Mm-hmm. So the normal range varies, but you ideally want to be in the upper half of that. The next thing we look at is a hormone called T3. 80% of your T3 is made outside of your thyroid. So when your thyroid makes T4, it goes into the body, and what the body has to do with T4 is it has to convert it into T3. Because T3 is our active thyroid hormone. That's the one that gives us energy and helps us make serotonin so we have a good mood, helps keep hair on our head, helps keep us warm, helps our metabolism go. And so most of that is happening outside the thyroid in places like your liver, your brain, your muscle, your digestive system. And so T3 is actually what I think is the most important thyroid hormone because it's the workhorse. It's the one that gives you all the good feelings that you're looking for. And again, it's rarely tested for. Yeah. And the reason it's so important is that one of the main things that I see happening, especially for women, and that's because that's who I treat, your thyroid could be working fine, meaning your TSH is great, your T4 is great, but then your T3 is not good. It's low. Part of why it's low is that one of the main things you need for your body to turn this T4 hormone into T3 is iron. What's the number one deficiency? You would know this from the work. Iron. Iron deficiency is it's the number one kind of worldwide deficiency among women, right? Yeah. And so most of us don't even have one of the key ingredients we need in order to make that conversion. The other thing is that conversion happens mostly in the liver and the digestive system. A lot of us are not eating and living in a way that supports great liver and digestive health. And so that can also impair that conversion. And then the last piece is stress. Stress really slows down that conversion. And that's why stress does have such an impact on the thyroid because it messes up that T4 to T3. So those are some of the things that we look at. The last two things that would round out kind of my thyroid panel would be those two thyroid antibodies that we just talked about, the TPO and the TG. That's going to tell us whether or not your thyroid issue is autoimmune. Yeah. So it just helps us to understand the cause, like you said, of the problem. Yeah. And then the last one is a hormone called reverse T3. Reverse T3 is basically the opposite of the T3 we talked about. So again, T3 is the active one that does all the things you want. Reverse T3, I refer to it lovingly as the hibernation hormone because it does the opposite.
The couch with a blanket.
You do. You're going to be tired. You're going to feel sluggish. You're going to be cold. You're going to be packing on the pounds, because your body is literally trying to slow you down. It's trying to conserve energy. Mm-hmm. Remember what I said at the beginning, your thyroid controls your metabolism. If you're healthy and relaxed and you're eating well and you're moving, your thyroid would be like, great, we're going to create like a healthy metabolism. If you're stressed out, your body never knows when food is coming, you're over or under exercising, you're dealing with a pandemic, you're trying to homeschool your 3 children, your brain is like, what the heck is going on? And then your thyroid gets that message and it's like, this is way too scary. I'm going into hibernation mode because I don't really know what's happening right now. Yeah. And so it's a protective mechanism that was evolved so that we don't literally waste energy when the body is under stress. The problem is most of us are under stress all the time. And so we typically make high levels of this reverse T3. And so if you have high levels of reverse T3, it almost doesn't matter what your other stuff looks like in terms of your TSH. Reverse T3 is slamming on the brakes. Yeah. It's like throwing an axe in the middle of the whole operation. So it's really important because it gives us a really good sense of how your thyroid is being impacted by stress. And it also helps us understand kind of how your overall thyroid is functioning in terms of comparing your T3, which is the good stuff, versus the reverse T3, and making sure that those are properly balanced. So when I do a thyroid panel, that's what I'm doing. It's literally 6 different tests. It's, again, all done through blood testing. Costs about $100 out of pocket, and it really gives you a really full picture about what's going on with your thyroid.
Yeah. And I can guarantee right now, people listening and watching are having one of those aha moments going, I've never heard of any of this except TSH. What is going on? Yes. But it's true. They're all so necessary to put that whole painting together, right? Because you need the canvas, the brush, the paints, everything to be able to put it together. You can't just use one, because if the rest is missing, your painting isn't going to look great, right? It's not going to work right. And so we talked a little bit about that high T3, that hibernation. And so let's talk now, because I have had an aha moment in our first episode when you said to me that you're 5 times more likely to have a hypothyroid issue or a thyroid issue based on lifestyle. Right? Yeah. Based on lifestyle choices and inactivity, which blew my mind. I had no idea. And so lifestyle choices, nutrition, all of that can literally change how your thyroid's operating. So I want you to dig into that and tell us how those impact thyroid health.
Sure. So the first one I'll start with is physical inactivity. And as you just said, your risk of developing a thyroid issue goes up 5 times if you are physically inactive versus people who are regularly physically active. That risk is greater than the risk you would have from your genetics or from having a family member with a thyroid condition. We love to blame things on our genetics, and certainly we can blame our parents for some of our woes and bobos, but we also have to realize that the choices we make every day for almost all health conditions, but specifically for thyroid, are far more important than any type of poor genetic lottery that you were born into. Yeah. So for physical activity, we need to be moving. And especially when it comes to the thyroid does well with movement. And one of the ways that we can often know that the thyroid needs kind of some love and support is that if you're tired, but you do exercise and you feel better, that's usually a sign that your thyroid needs you to be doing a little bit more. Right? So as opposed to people who are tired and they do exercise and they feel worse after, in those cases, I'm actually looking more at what's happening with the adrenal glands. Okay. So exercise is really important. And, you talked about it in my bio. I'm a big fan of getting people to create healthy habits. And for most people, creating healthy habits means starting with something small and reasonable. So if you have not been moving your body, and a lot of us haven't with the pandemic, we've been less active, start with a 15-minute walk or a 10-minute walk. Start with something like bite-sized, even 5 minutes a day. Just start with something and try to make it a regular part of your routine, and then you can build on it. When I talk about physical activity, I'm not saying you need to go run marathons. I actually discourage against running marathons. As someone who used to do it, not good for your thyroid, because your reverse T3 is going to go through the roof because it's very physically intensive. Yeah. Do whatever activity makes you feel good, but you need to be moving your body every day, ideally for at least 30 minutes a day, and something that's going to get your heart rate up. Thyroid does like some cardiovascular activity. So doing enough that you're like a little bit out of breath, you're feeling your heart beating. It doesn't have to be any specific type of activity, but the 2 things that I want to highlight with exercise is that being sedentary is a risk. So is over-exercising. Right. If you are, and I'm not saying everyone who runs a marathon is overtraining, but some people who run marathons, triathlons, CrossFit, there are different types of exercise that can be just very intense for that particular person. Yeah. And it's another physical stress. So it's about, doing a moderate amount of physical activity is super important. Yeah. The other thing that I can't remember if we touched on last time is drinking water.
A little bit. And this one was, super interesting.
This was like a shocker for me when I learned it. Okay, so physical activity increases your risk like 5 times. The next biggest risk factor that we know of is the type of water that you drink. And so people who drink tap water, and this has been shown in multiple different studies, the more tap water you drink, the higher your TSH, the more likely you are to become hypothyroid. Part of that reason is that most tap water is going to contain chlorine and is going to contain fluoride. And as someone who works with a lot of minerals, you know this. Iodine, fluoride, and chlorine are all part of what we call the halogen family. Meaning when you look at the kind of that chemical or that nutrient, they look very similar in terms of their structure.
Yeah.
And so the reason that's important is that your thyroid is using iodine in order to make thyroid hormone. The more fluoride and chlorine that you have in your body, the more likely those are to come and like displace or block your iodine. Yeah. And so one of the things that I encourage people to do, if you can, is to get yourself filtered water to drink. And so there's a few different ones. I really like the Santevia filter. I know the Berkey filter is another really popular one. People always ask me about Brita. Brita will filter out a little bit of chlorine. It does not filter out fluoride. The ones that I've seen that filter out fluoride are the Santevia. Unfortunately, their water pitcher doesn't filter out fluoride, which I've learned. So you do need to get kind of like the full system. Yeah. And then there's another one that's called Zero Water. My concern with that, and you can touch on this, is that it removes all the minerals. And so that's not great. So if you're going to do something like that, or if you're drinking reverse osmosis water, which I did for a long time, you need to add minerals back in, because those minerals are actually so key for thyroid function. So making sure that you're drinking filtered water if you can, especially that's removing the chlorine and the fluoride, can help just support proper thyroid health. In terms of nutrition, one of the biggest messages that I'm trying to share is not so much about like necessarily what you eat, but what not to do. And one of the best things I think that women can do for their thyroid is to stop dieting.
Oh, okay.
And the reason is that anytime you go on a diet, it typically involves some type of restriction, where you're either restricting the amount that you're eating or you're restricting a part of what you're eating, whether it's carbs or fat or something else. We talked about this earlier. The thyroid is affected by everything you do. When you engage in a restrictive diet, that signals to your brain that that's a stress. Because your brain is always looking for threats, and food is food is a priority in life. If your brain senses that there's not enough food or that something's missing, it puts a lot of stress on your system. And again, when the brain senses stress, what does it do to the thyroid? It tells it to slow down to conserve energy as a protective mechanism. So part of what actually harms the thyroid so much is women who diet, and the process of losing weight and regaining weight is actually one of the most damaging things to your system physically, let alone all the mental, emotional stuff that it creates. But that would be, if there's one take-home message that I hope women get from today, it would be that dieting is one of the absolute worst things that you can do for your thyroid. So what is the flip side of that? Eating a wide variety of healthy and whole foods, which sounds so ridiculous to have to say, but we have to say stuff like that in our modern world, because we've become so polarized and so crazy with our nutrition that we have forgotten what like good food looks like. Most of us know what healthy food looks like. It's just we've gotten to this place where it needs to be counted or measured, or like we have to have all these rules. So a big part of what I encourage women to do with thyroid conditions is actually to remove a lot of the restrictions out of the diet, to put more healthy foods back in, to make sure that you're eating at consistent times. I know intermittent fasting is very popular right now, and I do like intermittent fasting, But for all women, actually, I recommend no more than a 14-hour fast. Like 12 to 14 hours for most women, you're going to get the benefit of fasting and you're not going to cause problems.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%.
Amazing. When you fast for 16 or longer than that, your body's like, there's no food coming. I have no idea when the next food is coming. That is stressful for me. And that creates a stress response, which again impacts your thyroid. So women need to be very careful with any type of restriction. For me, that is why I'm not a big fan of the keto diet for that specific reason. It removes almost all carbohydrates. It's a very, very low carbohydrate diet.
Yeah.
We know that one of the things that you need in order to convert T4 into T3 is insulin. And so when you're eating a super low carbohydrate diet, your insulin drops, which is great for some things. But if you're always hanging out in a low insulin state, again, that has some negative repercussions for your thyroid. Yeah. So eating consistently in terms of timing. So yes, do a 12 or 14-hour fast. Make sure that you're eating, your 3 meals a day. Try to make them at a fairly regular schedule. Your body likes that consistency. And then in terms of specific foods, I'm a big fan of including foods that have iodine, because we know that's one of the building blocks for thyroid. You need iodine. And sadly, we don't get a lot of it in our standard North American diet. Yeah. So this can be achieved through fish and seafood. It can also be achieved through eating seaweeds or algae products, which are the most concentrated source. There's also a little bit of iodine in things like eggs. And then the other piece is getting enough protein. So we talked about this early. If you want to make thyroid hormone, you need iodine and you need tyrosine. Tyrosine comes from protein. So you need to make sure that you're getting adequate protein throughout the day. And then my last piece would be to make sure you're getting minerals, which I'm sure you'll be a big fan of. You need, minerals.
Yay!
Yay! Whether through diet or supplement, we need minerals. They're so important. And again, when we're looking at thyroid, your ability to make thyroid relies on minerals. And then your ability to convert it to T3 requires other minerals. So minerals are so important in order to get, again, you want to make sure that you're giving your body the building blocks that it needs so that your thyroid has what it needs to do its job.
Yeah.
The last thing I'll touch on quickly, because it's common question, is things like can I eat broccoli and kale and cauliflower?
Cruciferous, yes.
Cruciferous. So cruciferous vegetables are things like kale and broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts. And a lot of people who have thyroid conditions feel like they can't eat them because there is something in those that can block iodine. In my experience and based on the research, you would have to eat an enormous amount of those to cause a significant problem. Yeah. And there's so many other benefits to those specific vegetables. So I encourage people to eat them. What I always say is don't eat a trough-sized salad with raw kale and broccoli every day. You'll probably be okay. Have some of it raw, eat most of it cooked, which is those veggies tend to taste better cooked anyways. Yeah. You're going to be fine, right? The other one I'll touch on is soy, which is another very controversial one, especially in the thyroid world. People love to hate on soy. Again, soy can be a goitrogen in large quantities. Unless you are consuming, and I believe from my the numbers were you have to consume, I think it's a liter of soy milk plus a block of tofu. You have to be eating an enormous amount of soy for it to cause problems. So if soy is part of your diet that you enjoy, and preferably you're choosing organic soy and you're having it once in a while, it's very unlikely that's going to be causing a thyroid issue. Yeah. So those are two of the foods. Again, I'm a big fan of helping people actually bring more foods into their diet, because most of the women I work with, especially when they have a thyroid condition, if you go online and you Google Hashimoto's diet or a thyroid diet, it's going to tell you to cut out about 20 different foods. Oh my gosh. Which is probably unnecessary for most people, right? Yeah. And then the stress of removing all of those foods and feeling you can't eat anything is also very harmful for the diet. So I try to bring a more balanced approach to nutrition in that regard, because I think we're actually causing a lot of harm with some of the very restrictive diets that we're recommending for people.
Yeah. And I agree. It does cause so much stress, right?
Mhm.
People go into the grocery store, they're like, I don't even know what I can eat anymore. And I don't even know what to buy. And like, eat the rainbow,
Yeah,
add in some fish, some healthy fats,
yeah,
and everything should have one ingredient
yeah,
because that's a whole food.
yeah.
It's as simple as that,
It is.
right?
It's true.
It's so
Yes,
easy,
yes,
and can
yeah,
have such great benefits because again, we are that society that is stressed. We're dealing with even more now, right? More stress. And now and we want things to be super convenient. So it's like
mhm,
things that come in a package sometimes are really convenient, but what's in it,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And that can be a scary road to go down, right? And try and reverse that. And so I think those were some amazing suggestions and very easy to be able to implement. And again, you're kind of coming back to that everything in moderation, right? You can have the broccoli, you
yeah,
can have the cauliflower
totally.
and the spinach, whatever it is, just in moderation. Enjoy all of it, right? And not just one of it every
Yeah,
single day in mountainous amounts. And so I want to dive into your group program because you launched this now.
yes,
So after a decade of research and working one on one and
yes,
all of this in
yes,
2020, and it was a huge success. And so
yes.
tell everybody about that, how the program works, what they can expect to experience, learn, how you're working with people, because I think that's pretty amazing.
Thank you. So the program is called the Happy Thyroid Reboot, and it's a 4-week program where I'm basically teaching people the 4 kind of foundational things that they want to think about when they're looking at thyroid health. So these are the kind of the 4 most important things that I've identified, like you said, in my 10 years of doing
Probably
this work.
plus 10 years plus because we're
Plus,
forever
yes,
students, right?
yes, exactly. And so the 4 pillars that we work on, the first one is hydrate. And
Mm,
this is where we really dive deep into the whole water conversation. And what was super interesting in our last group is like people's mind were like blown open when we started to talk about tap water and the importance of filtration. And so we really talk about that. And I know that it is so basic, but most people I see are underhydrated,
yeah.
either because they're not drinking enough water, or
Mhm.
if they are, they don't have enough minerals to actually absorb the water. And so they're drinking it and they're peeing it right out. And so we always start with hydration because if you are dehydrated, you're going to have more symptoms that look like thyroid symptoms. And so it's really hard to distinguish what is actually your thyroid and what's just dehydration. And so that's the first piece that we work on. The second part is where we look at nourishment. And this is really where we talk all about nutrition. We talk about specific foods that help to provide iodine and tyrosine. And we also dive a little bit more into some of the harms of dieting and how those really have a specific impact on your thyroid.
Yeah.
The third pillar is move. And so this is where we really talk about the importance of physical movement and what types of exercise can work best for your thyroid. And then the last piece is rest. And this is really where we talk
Mm,
about the importance of stress management
yeah.
and proper sleep and the impact that those have on the thyroid. Because as we've talked about many times today, the thyroid is very sensitive to stress. And so we really talk about very specific strategies that we can use to help protect the thyroid from some of the negative impacts of the stress. So it's a group program. It runs over 4 weeks. And so each week you get a 90-minute session live with me where I do teaching. And then there's lots of time for Q&A. So it's a really great way to ask those questions that you've probably had for a long time about your thyroid, that you've probably Googled, but aren't
Mhm.
sure like of the answers that you've gotten. And the beautiful thing about doing it in a group is you also get the support and the encouragement of the other people in the program. So one of
Absolutely.
the things that our participants found really helpful last time was to realize, like, number one, oh my gosh, I'm not alone. There are
Yeah.
other people who feel the same way that I am. I'm not crazy. There is something going on with my thyroid, and also just feeling very empowered to understand how they can take care of their thyroid. Because again, typically the conversation that's had when you're diagnosed is you have hypothyroidism. Here's your medication. You'll be taking it for the rest of your life. Goodbye.
Yeah.
And patients are left like, what? Like,
What?
what do you mean? So I really created this program as a really great kind of starting place for people to know, number one, how their thyroid works so they can better understand it.
Yeah.
Because I feel like for most people, it's easier to make habit changes when you understand why you're doing them and what impact it's actually having. And so I'm a big proponent of teaching people how their body works so that they know how to better take care of it. And then I help guide them through these 4 pillars. So it's a really wonderful program. Our next one is going to be opening up in March. So I'm happy I can send you some details if we want to post that.
Absolutely.
If people are interested in learning more about the Happy Thyroid Reboot.
Yeah, absolutely. I will make sure that we have that in the description. And yeah, I think that, you know, the approach that you're using with regards to education with the functionality of the body is the key, right? When people understand, okay, what I'm doing, this is why. When they have that why, that is so impactful. And I think that that is an amazing takeaway. Like, they're going to leave that 4-week program and be so far ahead of the pack to be able to change their health for good. And I think that's really amazing. And so thank you so much. That was so much information. People are going to be sitting, I can just see them right now, either in their car, they're driving, listening to a podcast, and their eyes are popping out of their head going, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start. And so they can start with your program because it's coming in March. There we go. So thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us again. Just again, a wealth of information. What you bring to the table is incredible. And the fact that you're empowering women with your group setting is even more incredible. So you're doing great work. Keep it up. And so for those of you watching on YouTube, we have a brand new episode every 2 weeks. Make sure you give us a thumbs up. And for those of you listening on your favorite podcast host, make sure you give us a like. And all of the details will be in the description for how you can work with Dr. Sarah. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to today's show. Head over to Pitel-Killah.com to gain access to some amazing free resources that will help you gain energy, erase debilitating symptoms, and be the best version of you. Remember to give this podcast a like and follow me on social media at Lisa Pitel-Killah. I'm here every 2 weeks with a brand new episode of the Human Optimization Podcast. Until next time.